thank you for being with us. It's really clearly an honor for a lot of people to listen to you, and probably they're also being shy to ask questions. But here we are. The first question is, so what are informal settlements, or as you call self-made cities? What are they?
I think that around the world, these are very different communities. We cannot come up with one uniform definition. In a lot of countries, that is a long-term trend, unfortunately, one that has accompanied the move to cities. Cities around the world are places of hope, places of employment, places of growth and prosperity. But for a lot of people around the world, cities are not necessarily bringing happiness and quality of life. They end up being part of the margins. And these self-made cities are in fact very viable neighborhoods with a lot of economic and social opportunities. In the post-socialist world, this is a relatively new phenomenon, one that has defined, unfortunately, a lot of the post-socialist transformation with a number of unintended consequences. So in many post-socialist cities, in fact, up to 40% of the residential area ends up being part of the informal development, particularly in Central Asia, but also in the Balkans, the Southeast Europe.
How can we recognize an informal settlement? What are the main characteristics?
A lot of the informality is related with the fact that these communities do not necessarily exist in the urban planning documentation. They're not part of the cadastre registration, but to a large extent these issues are gradually being addressed. What is really critical is the sheer size of these neighborhood formations, sometimes with thousands of families, and also not just residential development, but also retail, a lot of industrial jobs, a lot of really informal economy. In some of these places, the share of the informal economy is up to 40% of the GDP. So we need to understand that these are places where a lot is happening, and it's not just about vulnerable people or people on the margins, but it's also about places where a great deal of the economic cycle is outside of the formal world.
What is the scale of the phenomenon? How many people? Because you talk a lot about people, not settlements. What's the scale?
I think that some estimates suggest that within Europe, there would be 15 million people that are part of these formations, and that is not necessarily including the wave of refugees in refugee camps that are again adding, unfortunately, another 3 to 5 million. It's a very significant urban phenomenon.
Are there any specificities to this phenomenon in the post-socialist Europe? You started.
There are salient characteristics which are very much associated with the transition to markets in post-socialist cities, and the fact that privatization took place very quickly. In some places there is rapid urbanization. Some of the countries in former Yugoslavia, but also places like Albania, experienced a rapid migration to those cities. So it's a fairly recent phenomenon, but also one that is associated with lack of transparent markets for land, different real estate dynamics. So very often these are not necessarily the slums or the shanty towns that we see around the world. These are actually very viable parts of a city where indeed with legalization and investment in infrastructure, very quickly some transformation and integration is possible. Another important characteristic in this range of informal settlements is that what I call them the landscapes of despair. There would be many communities where indeed a lack of housing, but also citizenship rights and rights to welfare in the city will be a different characteristic. So these would be often communities of refugees, internally displaced people, Roma communities, and some of these communities actually have existed for a fairly long period of time.
I would narrow it down a bit to the situation in Romania as much as you could have input from this conference, and how would you frame this situation in the big landscape of informal housing?
I think from what I understand in Romania, the situation is really quite problematic in a sense that obviously it's a significant concentration of people, both in cities but also rural areas. And it seems that for a very long period of time, for over 25 years, that issue has not been addressed at the central government level or the municipal level, where really a lot of these communities have to interact with municipal governments and other political entities. So there are multiple patterns of exclusion, and that really is more significant and begins to impact on housing rights, but also human rights. And it is very important to begin to address some of these issues. In some of the discussions that we had today with people that are residents in some of these communities, and some of these were actually children, so they grow up there, and it appears that 4 generations have actually shared that home over time. There was an interesting phrase, we should shout as loud as we can. So I think that it's very important to begin to address the issue, work with community members to mobilize a lot of support, and these voices need to become part of an agenda that is not just about urban planning and city making, but it's also about the future of Romania as a country and the Romanian nation. It is about an integrated country, an integrated Europe, where children want to have a place, and a place that they can call home as opposed to a no man's land.
That would also hit on the question about the possible path to take in Romania. If you have fairly addressed it now, so I will move a bit in other areas to capacitate your experience in working in other countries. What have other countries done to engage this problem? Like practically, what are the solutions at hand?
I think that there have been a lot of really attempts to implement ideas in practice. I don't think that there is one uniform solution that obviously addresses the complexity of the issues and the range of informal exclusion and correspondingly integration. A lot of the countries, a lot of the post-socialist cities have experimented with legalization, which is the simple and straightforward step and that has been implemented across the board, and with a lot of incentives to actually provide both the technical and the financial tools so that the legalization can proceed. And then the second step is more about integration and bringing some services together with the provision of infrastructure, making sure that in a lot of these places actually people have the right to housing, they have access to water, and also access to social services, like children can go to school, for example, and people could have jobs.
Sorry, we need to interrupt this one because the live one is going to happen in 5 minutes.
Okay.
There is only one question. I don't know if we can make it in 5 minutes. It's about the differences and similarities of slums in the global south and the developed countries. Can we make it in 5 minutes? I think so, right?
Sure.
Yeah? Okay, so we'll just finish this now so we can take the radio interview live.
Okay.
Okay. Tell us please, what are the differences and similarities of slums in the global south and in the developed countries? Similarities.
I think that in the global south, unfortunately, informality is way more prominent than anyone wants to believe. A lot of the urban growth and the migration to the cities is actually part of those informal areas. Across the board in the global south, cities will actually accommodate over 70% of the residents in those informal places. I think Europe is different. They were, of course, the 60s and the 70s, through a lot of the urban renewal programs, did actually resolve one way or another with a varied degree of success informality in European cities. In the post-socialist world, again, that is a new phenomenon, one that will be challenging to address given the financial and the fiscal position of local governments and perhaps more limited economic opportunities in a lot of these cities. But on the positive side, I think that we're dealing with a fairly well-educated population, residents that would be able to actually take charge and begin to address their own welfare in a more significant way. We are also dealing with a lot more robust set of welfare provision from the central state as well as the local state compared to the global south. So indeed, we have a very different situation. Nevertheless, the challenge is very significant, and throughout Europe, I think the expectations for quality of life and people's welfare are a lot higher indeed. But concentration of poverty in some of these places is a very unfortunate manifestation of some of the problems that European cities are experiencing.
If you were to address, let's say, a politician or a member of administration, national administration, what would be your advice or your mobilization word to tackle this phenomenon in Romania?
I think it's really a journey of 1,000 steps, and it seems overwhelming. It's very, very important to have an action-based approach, again, a more strategic approach, so that the incremental steps that are undertaken really have a strategic direction and people begin to develop some trust, both within the community, but also what I call the vertical trust, beginning to trust governments and politicians. This is not a stop and go type of solution, and anywhere in the world where we have seen it working, it has been with a long-term buy-in from the community as well as the politicians. I think democracy has a price, and it's really about trust and trust within the institutions.
Thank you.